are a number of other aspects of this that I've written about that I'd like to share momentarily. But I'd like to turn to my good friend, Congressman Charlie Dent from Pennsylvania, as he wishes to share a few concepts and perspectives on this conflict.
Well, I thank the gentleman from Nebraska for organizing this special order this evening to discuss this crisis in Syria. You know, in my view, it's really indisputable that Bashar al-Assad is a villain who has committed heinous, mortal crimes with the use of chemical weapons against his own people. What is debatable, however, is America's policy on Syria and the broader Middle East. You know, by the way, I have raised the issue of Syria with this administration at numerous hearings as a member of the Appropriations Committees. You know, I've also worked with Syrians in my own community, and I have the largest population of Syrian Americans of any member of Congress in the United States. I've met with them. They brought to my attention issues of abducted Christian archbishops who have been abducted in Syria, whose whereabouts, unfortunately, are unknown. There's a lot of work going on to try to secure their release, but that said, you can understand their concern for that part of the world. I have spent time, too, you know, in meetings with America's wonderful friend, King Abdullah of Jordan, who has also shared his perspective on the plight of the Syrian people. But what I've observed most of all, it's a very sad observation, and that is the friends of the Syrian regime, Iran, Russia, and Hezbollah, are far more committed to President Assad than the friends of the Syrian people. That would be the West and the Arab League, you know, are to these moderate opposition forces. You know, I had asked Secretary Hillary Clinton, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, back in February of 2012, if the administration was prepared to provide some type of material support to moderate secular opposition groups, given that it looked like Assad's government was very weak, there was a popular uprising, and it seemed that you know, there might be a better outcome. And she was pretty clear with me at the time that she thought that providing light arms would be of little help to the opposition in the face of Assad's substantial military, with all his air assets, artillery, and armor. You know, to put it bluntly and in short, you know, she really didn't want to get too involved at that time. We really didn't have much of a discussion about the benefits to America, its friends, its allies, and their interests. You know, if Iran's influence in the region were substantially weakened through the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad. And I thought at times that the President maybe was more concerned with maintaining his reputation as a Nobel Peace Prize winner, anti-war candidate, than actually developing what I thought would have been a more practical response for Syria. It just seemed that, you know, inaction and indecision were, and frankly today remain, the order of the day. You know, in the meantime, you know, let's fast forward, you know, from back a year and a half, 2 years ago to today, al-Nusra and other radical Islamist terrorist organizations have really rushed into this vacuum, filled the void, so to speak. So really today there aren't any good public policy outcomes for the United States. The time for the United States to more constructively intervene and to reach a more efficacious resolution, the time for that has long passed. And so now here we are. You know, over these last 2.5 years, this Syrian civil war has descended into both a sectarian and proxy conflict. And these events have moved well beyond the United States' ability to control, you know, with Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia fully committed to the Assad government. And I think we all know, as Mr. Fortenberry knows, and again appreciate his leadership on this, we know that we have a very war-weary population, which is not going to support a half-hearted, poorly thought-out military strike, which will only expose the United States and its friends to greater risks, you know, including the possibility of a broader regional conflagration. This could include more chemical weapons attacks against the Syrian people and possibly Israel, potential cyber attacks on American critical infrastructure in both the financial services and energy sectors, an unleashed Hezbollah, and other unforeseen asymmetrical responses. I'm deeply concerned about this, as we all should be. But we can't just look at Syria in isolation. We have to look at it in the much broader context of the Middle East. And unfortunately, and I'm going to have to be a bit critical here of the President at this time, that, witness how President Obama turned his back on Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, in 2011 after 2 weeks of uprising. Whatever his faults, whatever his shortcomings, Hosni Mubarak was a loyal 30-year friend of the United States. A lesson learned by our friends and our allies throughout the region and throughout the world. Of course, back prior to that incident, there was the Green Revolution in Iran, where we saw a lot of very brave people in Iran stand up to the Ahmadinejad regime in Iran. We witnessed that. And it seemed that this administration could barely utter words of support to these very brave people who stood up to a tyrant, Ahmadinejad, who, obviously, who made all sorts of reckless and inflammatory and hateful statements against the West and particularly Israel. And so I was just astounded that the administration could barely utter words of support. Then of course we learned about leading from behind in Libya, actually leading from behind the French and the British in Libya, to be precise. And I was one of only a handful of Republicans in the House to support the authorization for force in Libya, after the fact, but I supported it. So I'm not an isolationist. I believe that we have an important role internationally with the United States, and we have to be constructively engaged. But let's move forward quickly, though, to 2013. Bashar Assad's government launches chemical attacks against his own people. I believe the intelligence is clear that, in fact, he did it, or his government did it, and so I'm not debating those facts, what appear to be facts. But we witnessed these chemical attacks in both the late spring and, again, just a few weeks ago in August of these chemical attacks. We witnessed again the trampling of the red lines set down by the President, not once but twice, and maybe more than that for all I know. And now with over 100,000 Syrians killed, what is the President's strategy for Syria? I couldn't explain it to anybody if they really asked. He's talked about pinpricks, or his administration has talked about pinpricks, shots across the bow, a military action of days, not weeks, no intention to topple Assad or to degrade his military capacity to make war on his own people, for that matter. I'm learning a lot about what we will not do, but I'm not really sure what we're trying to do or trying to accomplish. So, a very limited airstrike to punish Mr. Assad's not going to alter the outcome of the Syrian civil war. What is the point or purpose? What is the clarity of mission? In my view, America's national interest is really twofold in Syria. One, we want to limit Iranian influence in the region, and two, the other issue, of course, deals with securing those chemical weapons. And frankly, from both the Assad government and the radical elements of that opposition, who would be probably just as inclined to use those. So much so that King Abdullah of Jordan came to Congress, to members of Congress, to express his real concern about al-Nusra forces getting too close, dangerously close, to chemical sites in southern Syria. That was just a few months ago. And so now we also witness, too, that there really is not a coalition of the willing to tackle this Mr. Assad's crimes. It seems more like a coalition of the unwilling. We have the United Nations really doesn't seem anywhere to be found, although in recent days, in the last 24 hours, we're hearing that there might be some discussion with the Russians about some kind of a resolution on securing those sites, but the UN is really nowhere to be found. NATO does not seem to be fully engaged at all, although maybe some members are supportive. And of course, we witnessed what the British Parliament did to Prime Minister Cameron in rebuking him. And so the British are very, dear and beloved friends and allies, are not going to be engaged in this one. So we're pretty much on our own. Again, I've called this a coalition of the unwilling. And so I think it would behoove the United States not to move in what appears to be almost a unilateral manner. I've read, too, recently that that some of the Arab governments, Saudi Arabia and others, would be willing to help pay for some of this mission should we strike. Well, on the one hand, I appreciate that. And the other, the United States military is really not a mercenary force for anyone. And a lot of folks may be encouraging us or cheering us on, but it doesn't seem they're willing to put people in harm's way. And so I think we have to keep that in mind as we talk about this. And I'm going to conclude in a moment, but you know, I was one of the folks who said, you know, it's always important for the President to consult with Congress prior to taking any kind of military action. It's important in our system. Although I don't believe the President necessarily needs a congressional authorization for what he has called a very limited airstrike. But now that he's asked me to engage in this debate, again, I owe the President, you know, fair consideration of his policy in Syria, whatever it may be. And again, I've said call me skeptical. Now you can call me outright opposed. I've said from day one the President didn't seem to have his heart in this impending military action. He was looking for a way out. After the UN, the UK, NATO, a lot of our friends just not willing to be going along, then the President turned to Congress as a last resort for an authorization, where he, of course, has run into very, very heavy skepticism, to put it mildly. You know, I just didn't see any Churchillian resolve in our Commander-in-Chief. You know, our men and women in uniform deserve a Commander-in-Chief who is full-throated in support of what is likely to become a very dangerous military operation and could possibly spiral out of control. But more importantly, we have to be cognizant of the potential consequences and ramifications for that action. You know, I think the President of the United States owes that to the American people to make it clear what his policy is, what his mission is. Not what he's not going to do, but what he intends to do. So, you know, and after, you know, the President really threw this issue to Congress, we witnessed, you know, President Assad's jubilant supporters celebrating in the Syrian streets, and I'm sure the corridors of power in Tehran and Moscow. And it seems now that, you know, America's friends and allies, you know, watch this mystifying failure of presidential leadership unfold with dismay. So have I. So have our constituents. We've all received these calls. You know, it just, in my view, and I'm really sad to say this, that Barack Obama may have diminished his own presidency in the process, but more problematically, diminished America's standing in the world among both friend and foe alike. And that's a real tragedy. You know, in this upcoming vote in Congress, if it's to come at all at this point, is really not so much a vote on authorizing a military strike or military intervention in Syria. The stakes have grown beyond that. It's much more a vote of confidence on the President's Syrian and broader Middle East policy. On that score, I have no confidence. And I just wanted to say one last thing. I mentioned I have a very large Syrian population in my community, Syrian Americans, great Americans. They've been part of my community for a long time, largely Christian, Antioch Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Presbyterian, and other denominations. They are scared. I think they know what Bashar al-Assad is, and many are very uncomfortable with what he is. And on the other hand, they have seen al-Nusra and al-Qaeda and are absolutely terrified of that operation. And so they're caught in this sectarian crossfire. They don't want to be there. They're worried about atrocities, grievous atrocities being committed against the Christian people of Syria. We just witnessed the other day, there was a story of a real small village, I believe not too far from Damascus, where the language of Aramaic is spoken. Well, I guess one of the few places in the world where it is still spoken. Why is that significant? Well, if you're a Christian, you know Aramaic was the language that Jesus Christ spoke. And you know, to know that this ancient community, and of course much of Syria is an ancient civilization, that to know that, you know, that these people could be under attack when you find out that al-Nusra forces had entered and intervened, and I hope they've been cleared out. But that said, you know, you think about this, and we worry about, you know, the history of mankind, the history of the Christian tradition, you know, is at risk here, and potentially a great risk of extermination. And we've witnessed this in Egypt too. I mean, there are lessons to be learned from Egypt. When Mubarak fell, the Christian population, the Coptic Christian population of Egypt, became very vulnerable. We know that. Extremely vulnerable. Atrocities committed against Christians, desecrations of the churches, burnings, other terrible things have happened. And I fear that we might see similar, if not worse, things happen in Syria. So whatever this country chooses, whatever course of action this country chooses to pursue, I don't believe that a military intervention right now by the United States would advance America's policy objectives. And frankly, I don't think it would change the trajectory of the Syrian civil war. You know, people have said, well, doing nothing at all is the worst of all possibilities, worst of all options. Well, I would argue that if we're not certain what this so-called limited military intervention will bring, if we're very unclear about that, then I would argue that no action is better than a limited action which may not do much of anything to alter the course of this civil war. So I think we have to be very cautious and very restrained. And I do appreciate the gentleman from Nebraska allowing me this opportunity to speak on this issue, and for his leadership and for allowing me this time. So I yield back to the gentleman.
Well, let me thank you as well, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, my good friend. I've heard you speak behind the scenes in this body, particularly today, with great passion, particularly for the people who are directly impacted by this, people who you represent and are directly connected to the conflict, the ancient Christian community, as you said. I appreciate your clarity and your resolve on this issue, because I know you, as I do, have great respect for the institution of the presidency. He is our commander-in-chief. But we also have a responsibility to render to him our judgment in this case. And so my judgment is no, that a unilateral military strike is going to accomplish an objective of potentially stabilizing, punishing, preventing Assad from doing further harm and stabilizing that situation, versus pulling the United States as a coalition of one into a conflict where we are very unclear as to what the collateral damage and destabilization outcome could actually be. In addition to that, the American people are intuiting that there's a serious, serious problem here with us being drawn into another conflict where the options are all bad, where our hearts are with the innocent victims, and we will continue to provide humanitarian aid. But we must not allow the international community to simply hide behind our military might. And I think that that is what the people are sensing, that we are being drawn into something that has much broader implications for the entire international community to respond in a constructive, creative way. And if we would have expended this energy, as I said earlier, on trying to get underneath the problem and perhaps point the finger and lay it at the steps of the Russians, who are completely entangled in this situation, maybe we would have had better movement on this question prior to now. Now, we'll see what the President says tonight. We'll listen with open mind. I don't know whether he is going to pull back from his intention to potentially strike Syria or not, but I think it is prudent to allow some diplomatic actions to potentially take their course, even though that might be a bit far-fetched at the moment, but hopefully that new diplomatic momentum has some good creative elements and stops the situation, pressures Assad, brings about a collective international response that stabilizes the situation and protects innocent people. I think that's the best outcome that we could potentially hope for here.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
It seems that the policy of the United States in Syria, since the beginning of the uprisings in Syria, has largely been one of inaction and detachment. And in many respects, we outsourced the arming of the opposition forces to many of our good friends, the Turks, the Qataris, the Saudis, and others. And whether we like it or not, and we don't like it in many respects, many of the folks who are armed were people who don't share our interests and values, the al-Nusra forces in particular. But there are moderate forces. And, you know, if the United States had demonstrated some leadership early in during that conflict, to help identify moderate secular opposition forces that probably could have been multi-ethnic and secular. It could have been Kurdish and Christian and moderate Sunni and even Alawite. That might have helped bring about a more legitimate or a better opposition force that the international community would be rallying around, but that unfortunately has not happened. Now you read about large swaths of territory in Syria dominated by some opposition forces that have been rather radicalized, and that's unfortunate because there are many elements of the Free Syrian Army, of course, who really do want to try to bring about more representative government, and I think would embrace the values that you and I hold dear. But, you know, time has passed. Time has passed, and I just don't see a good outcome, as I stated earlier, at this point. And I just wish, you know, I think the American people understand this intuitively. And it also speaks to NATO. What's happening with NATO? A great organization. I believe in NATO. It's a collective defense organization. I believe in its military value and its political value. But it seems since the end of the Cold War, maybe it's kind of it's gone a little bit adrift. You know, if there's Turkey has been a loyal friend and NATO ally for decades. They are directly affected by this conflict in Syria. They may make demands of us and NATO at some point, and we're going to have to think that through as policymakers, what we would do if our good friends the Turks make a request of us, and certainly our good friends in Jordan.
If the gentleman would yield for one more moment. It's a good question you raise, and one that I pointed to earlier. New international constructs that might be using templates of old international constructs, but that are revitalized so that we can have collective operations, if necessary, to engage in this type of stopping of mass violence. The NATO allocations for many countries, they don't meet them year after year. In other words, the money they're supposed to contribute, they just don't do it. So who has to pick up the pieces? We do. There's a free rider problem, as we call it here. And you deal in a lot of international diplomatic circles, and you constantly hear it. Oh, the United States is the only one who has the ability. You're the only superpower. You must act, and you must be compelled morally, based upon who you are, to do something here. All of those are fine points. But in the 21st century, you have a shift of the global framework for international stability occurring. We have expended ourselves as a country for nearly 70 years providing that framework for global stability, politically protecting human rights. As I said earlier, not always perfectly. But the United States cannot single-handedly lift this burden for the entire world, particularly for countries who have benefited from our past sacrifice, who have the economic wherewithal, and should have the moral compass to be thinking constructively about regional organizations that stop this type of conflict before it starts and demanding just outcomes of sovereign territories. That is the long-term strategy. I recognize we're in a difficult moment because we're being pressured to decide unilateral military action or not. But this is the type of long-term thinking that I think will help bring about new models of international multilateral cooperation to prevent this from happening, but when it does happen, to have the right response in place.
Would the gentleman yield for one moment?
Sure.
Just want to say one more thing. You know, the President has said that this red line that was crossed was not his red line, but the international community's red line. That 98% of the world has opposed chemical weapons use and has agreed to the various conventions on chemical weapons. Unfortunately, 98% of the world isn't prepared to help us in this intervention. We're on our own, and I just wanted to point that out, and I yield back to the gentleman from Nebraska.
Well, our time has expired, and I do thank you for the good, constructive conversation. I appreciate your insights and clarity on the situation. It's complex, it's difficult, but again, unilateral military action allows the international community to hide behind our might, and it's simply not the right response at this time. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, gentlemen. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2013, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the privilege to be recognized to address you here on the floor of the House of Representatives, and I appreciate the presentation that's come forward from my colleagues from Pennsylvania and Nebraska with regard to the Syrian situation and the international issue that's in front of all of us. And I don't always find myself in complete agreement with the wisdom that emerges here from this microphone, but generally speaking, that's where I stand this evening on the Syrian issue. And I think that it would be of interest to the gentleman from Pennsylvania that myself and a couple of other members yesterday morning, perhaps day before yesterday in the morning, my days blend together, we sat down with Syrian Christians who were expatriates who had escaped from Syria and very interested in the cause there. And I understand that the gentleman from Pennsylvania has a good number of constituents that would be representative of the same cause. It was a very interesting conversation that we had in breakfast day before yesterday at Brussels, and the concern that they expressed essentially came back to it's hard to choose a good side in Syria, and that Assad's, of course, he's an evil dictator. We've known that for a long time. We have the Free Syrian Army that emerged as a force for good that seems to now be taken over by forces that are not so good. And so it appears to them, and it appears to me, that whether it would be the Assad forces that prevail in the end or whether it would be the forces that are taking over the Free Syrian Army, it's not going to be good for Christians in Syria. And I'm concerned that for us to find a way forward, the best hope for Christians in Syria is likely to be the moderate groups that began the Free Syrian Army in the first place, those groups that want to have a secular Syria that respects everyone's right of freedom to religion, freedom to associate, and respects the rights of humanity that we all defend here. And so I reiterate the statements that the gentleman from Pennsylvania has made, and we stand certainly with the Christians in Syria, but also the secular forces in Syria, however they've been marginalized by the forces of the Muslim Brotherhood, the forces that are Assad, and the anti-freedom forces that seem to want to take Syria over and use it for their own evil aims. And so having traveled, Mr. Speaker, over into that part of the world, not into Syria specifically, but into the Middle East, and we just came back last night from a trip that was to Tokyo. We spent several days there dealing with the top leadership in Japan, including Prime Minister Abe, and then from there to the United Arab Emirates, where we had a meeting set up with a number of the officials, and the first meeting was at 11 o'clock in the morning. We were scheduled to meet with the Crown Prince about 1 or 1:30 in the afternoon. Instead, he gave us a very pleasant surprise and arrived at our 11 o'clock meeting, and we were able to have a long, engaging conversation, doors closed, which gave us a very good perspective on the Middle East and on Syria. And so I appreciate my colleagues' focus and interest on this, and mine is also focused the same. And I see by body language that I'd be happy to yield to the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
I want to thank the gentleman from Iowa for his kind comments about his experiences with various folks who are in Syria. I just wanted to say one other thing, too. This past Sunday, I attended a church service at my own church that has a large Syrian community. And a woman made a presentation at the church who represents she's the leader of the Presbyterian Church of Lebanon and Syria, and spoke in my church in very moderate secular tones about why she thought it was not in anyone's interest for the United States to intervene at this point in the Syrian civil war. It was a very compelling statement. Then after that church service, I stopped by another church, St. George Antioch Orthodox Church, after their services had ended, and met with some of the parishioners whose family members are over there in many cases, some of whom told me that their family members have been killed. And there was a lot of crying and wailing and deep sadness. And this is, it's quite emotional for them, as you can well imagine, that they feel so strongly that this intervention is only going to make the plight of the Christians that much more dire and difficult in Syria, and that it could lead to their ultimate extermination in many cases, their term, not mine. And so that's how serious this is to them in a country that I believe, last I checked, is somewhere between 15% to 20% Christian, although the numbers are diminishing given this turmoil. And we've seen that in many Middle Eastern countries, that the Christian communities are just not able to endure in this type of environment. So I just appreciate your interest in this issue, Mr. King, and thank you for allowing me to speak, and keep up the work.
Claim my time, and I thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Dent. And I would add that there was some dialogue in that breakfast meeting with the Syrian Christians that took place day before yesterday in the morning about how there was a concerted effort to push and eradicate Christians out of all the areas in the Middle East. That seems to be something that they have embarked upon, and I know that there's a long history of it, over 1,000 years, but it's been accelerated here, I believe, Mr. Speaker, within the last few years. In fact, this date of this meeting goes back to 1982 when that began, and we're hearing the similar narratives about Christians that are being persecuted by both sides in this. And the population percentage in Syria of around 15% to 20% is, it fits with what I'm told. I added up the data that they gave me from different sections of the Syrian Christians, and my number came to about 2.6 million Syrian Christians, and there are also about 2 million Syrians that are refugees that have left Syria and that are now housed in, many of them in refugee camps in the surrounding countries. About 2 million refugees out, about 2.6 million Christians in Syria or around Syria altogether. I see that as almost the equivalent of the population of the state of Iowa. And so we've watched as Assad has persecuted his people. The people that were not anybody but his political allies were persecuted by him over the years. And I remember that, you know, he was identified by the Bush administration as, I believe, an evildoer. I remember some communications being opened up with Bashar al-Assad, and that took place in sometime in 2007 or 8. And I remember some pictures that came back from there. Well, this individual now has been identified as the head of the regime that has launched chemical weapons against his own people. The evidence that we see doesn't necessarily confirm that it would be Assad himself that gave the order, but it does appear that there were chemical attacks. It also appears that there were conventional artillery assaults into the same neighborhood that brought about many casualties, and to sort out whether they were chemical casualties or whether they were kinetic action casualties is a question that's not been answered yet. And I'm hesitant to get very far into this from a factual standpoint because of what's classified and what isn't, Mr. Speaker. But the forces in Syria, I want to make this point. It doesn't get brought out in this Congress enough, if at all. They are lined up on the side of either Sunni or Shia. And of course the Alamite sect of the Shia is the sect that is Assad himself, and he's supported by them. And when you look at his allies, Hezbollah, Iran, they are Shia. And if you look at his enemies, generally speaking, that his enemies are Al-Qaeda, Muslim Brotherhood, a list of those Sunni interests that have poured into Syria. At the beginning of this conflict, it was a conflict that was formed by the Free Syrian Army that wanted to unseat Assad and establish a government that would be of, by, and for the people of Syria, and consistent with American ideals and American principles of a government that's empowered by the will of the people instead of by the will of a dictator or a king. And so as the Free Syrian Army began, their forces were growing and they were strong and they were taking over territory, and since that period of time we've watched as the sometimes labeled as the rebels effect has diminished, and it's almost been in direct proportion to the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda, and other radical interests stepping in to take over and pick up some of the resources that are being used to support the opposition to Assad. And as I watch this, and from what I know and from the information that's come to me, continually the Free Syrian Army is more representative of the Muslim Brotherhood than it is the Free Syrian people, and not by majority of the population of the army itself, but by the leadership, by who commands the resources, by who's being trained. And this is now ever more clear that there's not a side that's easy to get on in this conflict and be confident that the forces are the forces of good. In other words, to identify the good guys has gotten ever more difficult month by month. It's more difficult today than it was a month ago or 2 or 3 or 4 or 6 months ago. But it doesn't mean that there aren't good influences, that there aren't good cores of people that we should be identifying with and that we should be strengthening and empowering. But from my view, anybody that supports Al-Qaeda or is of Al-Qaeda is our enemy. Anybody that is Muslim Brotherhood or supports Muslim Brotherhood turns out to be our enemy. The difference between Muslim Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda is they both have the same military wing. Muslim Brotherhood's got a lot broader political approach to this. But in the end, they're looking to establish the Islamic Caliphate everywhere in the world where they can, and establish Sharia law everywhere in the world where they can. And they don't view individual rights, human rights, or this God-given liberty and freedom that we claim here, that our founding fathers claimed for us here over 200 years ago. They don't have respect for that. They reject it, and their approach is not compatible with human rights. So we see the sectarian interests in Syria are taking over the secular interests in Syria, and I believe that there's an ability, if we can identify the good guys, to empower them, to train them, to fund them, supply them, that there's a way to bring this around and bring it to a good conclusion. But the people that need to be in power in Syria are a long ways from power, and the people that don't need to be in power, whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood side of this and the Sunni radical Islamists, or whether it be the Shia interests and Assad, are competing with each other now for dominance. They fought each other for centuries as well. There's no good result that can come easy in Syria. There is a good result that could come over a long period of time if our administration identified the people that we should be allying ourselves with, and if they could emerge as the strong force. But while that's going on, we've been offered something from Putin and the Russians that I don't think anyone expected a little more than 24 hours ago, and that is a way to avoid a military conflict and engaging U.S. forces in Syria. I will say, Mr. Speaker, that the mail that I'm getting and the phone calls that I'm getting are almost universally in opposition to going into any kind of military action whatsoever in Syria. Almost universal. All of my calls today were against going into Syria. Almost every call for the last week are against going into Syria. And it's not that I make decisions exclusively off of constituent input or American communications input. I have an obligation, and I owe my constituents, and I owe Iowans, and I owe the people in this country my best effort and my best judgment. And that includes the input that comes from them weighed more heavily than if it were not directly from my constituents. And I owe them my best effort and best judgment, and that is to go out and gather information, and I have probably the best access to the broadest amount of information of including myself among my constituents. So I owe them my best effort, and part of that best effort is to go and see with my own eyes and get into those parts of the world so that I can be fully informed, because this Congress is being called upon to make decisions that redirect the destiny of the United States of America. We should not do that in an uninformed way. We should not do that in a willfully ignorant way. And there are many things going on in the world that you cannot learn by listening to just briefings here or reading the paper. We should know from long history that you've got to drill into these things, you've got to look the right people in the eye, and you've got to verify the information that they give you. I've done that. I've done that over the last week. I kept my powder dry on Syria throughout that period of time because I wanted to gather all the information that I could. I didn't want to take a public position until I had seen as much as I can with my own eyes, hear as much as I can with my own ears. And even though we'd done a trip into Cairo and into the United Arab Emirates and into the Middle East, and we had briefings in countries beyond that, and briefings from our State Department. We met with, as I said, Syrian Christians, and we also met with refugees from Libya. We met with Special Forces interests and different perspectives on the Middle East entirely and different perspectives on the Syrian operation. You put that all together from State Department's position, and I came back with that, stacks of notes on it, Mr. Speaker. But I didn't want to speak either on my Syrian position until such time as I'd sat through the classified briefing that I knew over a week ago was scheduled for 5 o'clock yesterday, and that went on from 5 o'clock until about 6:45 last night. That briefing was useful. The people that were there to brief us were Susan Rice and Director Clapper and Secretary Kerry, and we also had Secretary of Defense Hagel and also General Martin Dempsey, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. 5 people of the highest level you could ask for, short the President of the United States, gave us a briefing with the data that they have and what they know, and they told us what was classified and what wasn't. They told us the conclusions they had drawn and some method about how they arrived at those conclusions. But my independent assessment doesn't agree with the course of action that seems to be the direction from the President of the United States. It doesn't mean that I disagree with the data that they have, but the conclusion and how to move forward I do disagree with. And I've taken a position today that if there were a vote on the floor today to authorize military force in Syria, that I would not support that, Mr. Speaker, that I would vote no. And I want to make it clear that I believe the President has the constitutional authority to order action in Syria or anywhere else. The President of the United States has to have that authority to order our military into action in an instant. Our Continental Congress was not very functional when it came to fighting a war by consensus. When they finally got through the Revolutionary War and put a country together and built a constitution that could be ratified by the majority of the states and of the 13 original colonies, and all of them in the end, they concluded that we needed to have a President of the United States who was also the Commander-in-Chief of the United States military, who was in full control of the military. And subsequent to that, there was a piece of legislation passed within the 20th century that was a War Powers Act that was designed to restrain the activities of the Commander-in-Chief, the President of the United States. Those two conditions, one, the constitutional authority of the Commander-in-Chief to order our military into battle in an instant without consulting Congress, and the other, the War Powers Act, which requires a President to come back after a period of time and consult with Congress. Those two, the Constitution and the War Powers Act, are compatible as long as they are respected by the Congress and by the President of the United States. And any time we're engaged in a long military engagement, I think the President should come consult with Congress. If it's a short operation and it's over before it can be consulted, that's consistent with the Constitution. I would point out when President Reagan ordered our military into Grenada, that was an operation that took place quickly. He came before the American people and let us know after it was launched that he had ordered military action in Grenada. It was a successful operation, and we pulled out of there when the objective was achieved. That was Ronald Reagan. When George Herbert Walker Bush, Bush 41, ordered our military into action in Panama to put an end to the dictator Noriega and the drug smuggler Noriega, that order was issued, and our military took to the field, and as that operation was unfolding, then we found out about the order of our Commander-in-Chief. This operation that's proposed in Syria is an operation that the President of the United States has the authority to order. He has the constitutional authority to do so. And if he had identified targets in Syria and was determined that that was the right course for America, the President should have then issued the order to engage our military in the fashion that his best judgment said he should. But what has happened instead is there's been a vacillation that's taken place. And he's sought to sell this to the American people while the message and the warning is going out to Assad. The red line that was drawn in the sand back during the presidential campaign, it appears that the administration thinks that line's been crossed multiple times, and if you cross a red line in the sand enough times, it gets pretty blurry over a while. Now they've decided that August 21st was the bright red line that was crossed by Assad, and here we are on the eve of the Benghazi attack, on the eve of the anniversary of the Benghazi attack. Tomorrow is September 11th, and on the anniversary, of course, of the September 11, 2001 attack, now we're negotiating with we're negotiating with Congress to get support to go into military action in Syria. My position, Mr. Speaker, is if the President thought it was a good idea, in a very limited way, as Secretary of State Kerry says, he should have done that. He should have issued the order, gotten it over with. If they're right and it's a very narrow operation, he could have pulled back and we would be done by now. But he watched as David Cameron and the United Kingdom took the issue before the British Parliament. The British Parliament voted down the initiative to strike Syria over the chemical weapons, and that put the brakes on the United Kingdom supporting us or any other entity in an operation in Syria. And when I think the President saw that, maybe concluded, well, I'll ask Congress. If Congress says no, then I'll have this responsibility, this cup taken from him, so to speak, the one that he asked for when he put out the red line statement during the campaign and the debate with Mitt Romney. So we're now in this situation where we've had a protracted national and global debate. And at each stop around the world where we've gone into Tokyo, into the UAE, into Cairo, into Brussels, and met with multiple entities along the way, Syria is the discussion matter. But they look to the United States to lead. And some of the countries don't think it's a very good idea to go in there, but they say they'll support us anyway because they want America to succeed. They understand that if we're not strong in the world, if we don't lead in the world, then this becomes a very precarious place. And so I had it expressed to me a number of times, we don't think it's a very good idea, but if you do this, we'll support you. Or, we think it's a bad idea, we have to support you anyway. But I didn't find anybody that said that they were really happy about the idea that America might strike someplace inside Syria to send a message to Assad. Some said, don't pave the road to Damascus for the Muslim Brotherhood. That the devil we know may not be as bad as the devil we don't know. And we're starting to learn that. So as this has unfolded, I heard the gentleman from Pennsylvania, I believe it was, mention NATO and a NATO operation. We aren't going to have the support of NATO in an operation in Syria. NATO operates off of a consensus. The 28 nations or so that are NATO now have a lot of trouble getting to a consensus. If some of those countries decide they don't want to participate, they'll just simply not commit their forces. And in the end, it comes down to what will the U.S. do, what won't the U.S. do. And we're not going to have the support of the United Nations. There's already been that effort to bring it before the United Nations, and we've got opposition from Russia and opposition from China. Now, maybe they'd reconsider. Maybe China would reconsider. Maybe Russia would reconsider. But the United Nations is not going to be there behind us, Mr. Speaker. NATO is not going to be there behind us. We will have perhaps a coalition, not of the willing, but a coalition of the unwilling, but those unwilling to allow the United States to, let's say, be embarrassed by this policy. So the best course forward appears to be the lifeline that was tossed to us within the last 24 hours by Putin from Russia. Said, let's take you up on your offer, Secretary Kerry, and see if we can gather up these chemical weapons and eradicate them from Syria. And if doing so will prevent a military strike, then let's give it a go. That's a British expression, by the way, Mr. Speaker, give it a go. Well, I'm for giving it a go. I think that's the best alternative we have. I think the military strike is a mistake because it runs the risk of paving the road to Damascus for Muslim Brotherhood and other radical Islamist entities that are part of that constellation that have been systematically marginalizing the true Free Syrian Army and empowering themselves, and some of them, with resources that we would see as sourced back to U.S. taxpayers. So the best course forward now is to work with the Russians and see if we can get the chemical weapons gathered together. I would want Americans involved in any kind of a mission to gather those chemical weapons. I think the United Nations showed an ability to go into Iraq before 2003 and do the nuclear inspection that was there. I was uneasy with their conclusions. In fact, I didn't agree with their conclusions. But they're the force on the planet that has an opportunity to have the credibility, the global credibility. If they get to that point where they say we've got all these weapons picked up, or they'll qualify their answer, that's the kind of thing that should be going on, Mr. Speaker. But in any case, any kind of inspection team, any kind of a chemical weapon collection team under the auspices perhaps of the United Nations, so that it isn't directly under, say, Russia or the United States, but with Americans there on the ground to verify the actions that are taking place and give us a sense of credibility and confidence. And, Mr. Speaker, I'd point out, it won't work to go there and just get the job done to eradicate the chemical weapons. You must do so in a way that has credibility so that especially the American people will accept a conclusion and we can perhaps move on. But picking up chemical weapons and gathering up that entire inventory, which is tons and tons of that inventory, if it's done so in a precision way, perhaps doesn't change the balance of the regime versus the forces for good and those evil forces that align themselves with the forces for good, perhaps doesn't change that balance or changes it in a more minimal way than a military strike would. And it would send the message that we'll put an end to the abuse of chemical weapons. It's also curious to me, Mr. Speaker, that this level of concern and outrage didn't seem to exist when chemical weapons were being used between Iraq and Iran during the Iraq and Iran war in the 80s. Doesn't mean it's all right. I think it's a good position to take against the abuse and the use of chemical weapons. But the red line itself, as far as a reason for America to put ourselves into a military conflict in a nation that we don't have much strategic interest in, is, I think, a mistake, and I would oppose that. And we should remember, again, who are the forces there? What message does this send to the world? What have we seen happen in the Arab Spring? And the Arab Spring that has emerged now, we're a couple years into that. It looks to me like the forces that have emerged on top have invariably been the Muslim Brotherhood. And so it isn't always good to see a change within a regime or administration. We saw Jimmy Carter, President Carter, support the return of the Shah in Iran and support ousting the current power, the power that was in Iran, and put the Shah in, thinking that there would be a representation that was a religious movement. The opposition to the Shah in Iran. In any case, the Ayatollah was viewed by President Carter as being a religious movement that was a voice of the people, and what we ended up with the Ayatollah instead of the Shah was a beginnings of radical Islam within Iran. And the flow that came from 1979 until today might have been different had we have taken a different position in Iran, where we had friends in Iran, now we have enemies in Iran. And as we have developed friends in Iraq, we're watching that friendship diminish. As we develop the foundation of support in Afghanistan, we're watching that diminish. And as we see that we have been strong friends in military alliance with Egypt, and we supported Mubarak, and he was our friend. We built military operations going on in the Sinai Desert. That took place with a good number of Iowans served there, and people from probably every state served in the Sinai in operations with the Egyptians. And then Mubarak was essentially pushed out, and the message that came from our administration was he needs to leave yesterday. Well, the Morsi forces were able to push Mubarak out. They held one election. 5.8 million of the 83 million Egyptians voted for Morsi. Morsi came in as an incompetent Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood came out of that on top again, like every other situation in the Arab Spring that's unfolded the last couple of years, Mr. Speaker. Now, the best break we've seen in Egypt is that 30 to 33 million Egyptians took to the streets. Their peak day was the 3rd of July. They took their country back. And yes, they had the support of the military, and some call it a coup, but there is no constitutional provision for them to impeach the incompetent Morsi. And the Egyptian people had had enough. You can't mobilize that kind of support unless there are many good reasons. The economic shambles that they allowed to take place and the injustices that were taking place under the Morsi regime. So now we have a new leadership that has taken a hold in Egypt, and I've met with the interim president of Egypt, President Mansour, and he makes it clear he's the interim president, that they're going to hand the country of Egypt over to an elected representative government. They're going to pass a constitution that they're busy writing now, and the military will let go of their control of the country and submit to the civilian leadership that emerges in a constitutional fashion. They've laid out a timetable and a roadmap, Mr. Speaker. So this is the best future that Egypt can hope for. Morsi was a mistake. He is Muslim Brotherhood. These forces are anti-Muslim Brotherhood. They are pro-Egyptian people, and I'm supporting the forces that are in place in Egypt now, and I would face-to-face encourage them. Move forward with the timetable that you have. It appears to be aggressive, and it has some risk, but writing a constitution, ratifying a constitution, and having elections, and establishing a civilian government in Egypt, and then handing the control of the military over to that civilian government is the right thing to do. It sets the right destiny for Egypt, and I think that the United States needs to do a 180 on the support of the people that are now in charge in Egypt. So I appreciate, Mr. Speaker, your attention and an opportunity to address you here this evening, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, gentlemen. The gentleman is recognized for a motion.
Mr. Speaker, I move the House do now adjourn.
Thank you, gentlemen. The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow for morning hour debate.
We just heard Representative